Alright, viewers. Let me take you straight into the storm. Picture the most powerful assembly on earth, the United Nations General Assembly. The chamber is heavy with silence. The ceiling lamps cast a cold glow over rows of suited delegates. Cameras stand ready, red lights blinking, transmitting every breath to billions of screens across the globe. Every diplomat waits, eyes fixed on the podium, for the show to begin. This hall has hosted presidents, kings, and tyrants. It has heard apologies, excuses, and lofty promises, but never what was about to unfold. And then, stepping up to the microphone, comes a young African captain from a landlocked country scarred by conflict and poverty. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. In his hand, he carries 12 neatly typed pages, not written by him, not even written in the voice of his people. They were written for him by others, in polished diplomatic language meant to bend his spine and tame his voice. It was a script of apology, a performance drafted to show the world that this small African nation would retreat, would kneel, would play its part in the theater of submission. But what he did next was unthinkable. Slowly, in front of the entire world, Captain Ibrahim Traoré folded the papers in half. No tremble in his hands, no second thought in his eyes. The camera zoomed in, capturing every movement. Then he looked up at the assembly and said, "They wrote 12 pages of apology for me. I folded it. I brought my own words." The shot cut through the chamber like thunder rolling inside a cathedral. Diplomats leaned forward in disbelief. Some gasped. Others whispered in French, in English, in Hebrew. In that single moment, the script of empire was set on fire by a man who refused to kneel. For decades, Africa had been told to remain silent, to obey quietly, to survive by submission. But that night, dignity itself walked onto the world stage and refused to bow. And so, I ask you, imagine this: if Washington, if our own president, were forced to stand before the world and read an apology written in Beijing or Paris, what would he do? Would he fold the paper, or would he surrender his voice for survival? That question should rattle your bones, because that is the storm we are diving into tonight. In the weeks before Captain Ibrahim Traoré's shocking stand at the United Nations, pressure had been building around him like a noose tightening at the throat. It began when he spoke openly about Gaza, condemning not only the violence but the silence of powerful nations. His words were raw, and scripted, and apologetic. They did not simply ripple across Africa. They detonated in the corridors of Paris, Washington, and Tel Aviv. Phones rang off the hook. Diplomatic cables shot across continents. Western media headlines carried warnings. Burkina Faso risks isolation. The message was clear. Clarify your words. But in diplomacy, clarification often means apology. And apology means surrender. Soon, the pressure took on shape. Anonymous officials whispered about frozen aid packages. Economists warned of cancelled trade deals. Reports of sanctions floated like storm clouds. Sanctions that could strip Burkina Faso of hundreds of millions in gold and cotton exports, lifelines for its fragile economy. These were not empty threats. They were daggers aimed at survival itself. And then came the closed-door meeting in a dim New York back room. The American ambassador arrived, leather briefcase in hand. With surgical precision, he snapped it open. Inside were satellite images of Chinese firms working Burkina's oil contracts worth more than $1.2 billion. A dossier hinting that Russian advisors were already embedded in his country. The message was blunt. We know everything. We control the script. Read it. But intimidation arrived hand in hand with temptation. After the threats came the velvet offers. Hundreds of millions in economic support. Preferential access to U.S. markets. Development deals dressed as partnerships. All he had to do was retract his words. All he had to do was read their 12-page apology, line by line, before the world. It was more than a speech. It was a test of obedience. Would Burkina Faso bend or stand? For decades, African leaders have been handed ultimatums dressed as diplomacy. Sign here. Accept this. Apologize for that. Each page a chain. Each signature a surrender. But this time was different. A young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, refused to carry the burden of humiliation. He was ready to turn pressure into spectacle. And so, when Captain Ibrahim Traoré folded those 12 pages at the United Nations, the moment became more than an act of personal defiance. It became a declaration that the quiet continuation of empire had been exposed. Ask yourself, When a leader is forced to read a confession written by foreign hands, is that negotiation, or is it simply colonialism in disguise? The world thought they had him cornered. Paris believed the young captain would bow. Washington whispered he was calculating his retreat. Tel Aviv prepared its next round of leverage. But what none of them realized was that Ibrahim Traoré had already begun a counterattack. Long before he stepped into that marble chamber, in New York's diplomatic corridors, rumors spread like wildfire. Captain Ibrahim Traoré is preparing to apologize. His aides leaked just enough hints to keep the illusion alive. Ambassadors congratulated themselves, convinced that their sticks and carrots had broken him. But behind the curtain, that hesitation was a mirage. Back in Ouagadougou, the streets were anything but silent. Flyers were plastered on walls. Hashtags multiplied. Live streams poured across social media. Crowds began to gather in the main square. First hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Waving flags, chanting slogans. Africa doesn't apologize. The air itself trembled with defiance. Western media, long reluctant to give Burkina Faso attention, suddenly had no choice. CNN, BBC, Reuters, they all carried the images of swelling crowds demanding dignity. Analysts estimated the visibility alone was worth more than $50 million in advertising. And yet, it had cost Captain Ibrahim Traoré nothing. It was pure, organic solidarity. Here lay the brilliance. While diplomats in New York believed they held the upper hand, Traoré had already built a new battlefield, the battlefield of public legitimacy. To his enemies, he looked weak. To his people, he looked unbreakable. To the world, watching through their screens, he was no longer isolated. He was the face of a storm rising from African soil. Then came his arrival in New York. The moment his plane touched down, the narrative cracked open. At the terminal, African migrants, taxi drivers, students, and workers flooded the gates. They waved Burkina flags. They held placards scrawled with raw defiance. Africa doesn't apologize. What was supposed to be an arrival became a headline. And it did not stop there. Outside the United Nations, a sea of African Americans, Caribbean activists, and justice groups filled the streets. Harlem marched with Ouagadougou. Brooklyn marched with Bamako. Their chants thundered. Dignity is not negotiable. News cameras zoomed in. In hours, the movement spread like fire. Analysts later said his arrival alone generated over $80 million worth of primetime media exposure. Inside his convoy, aides whispered updates. Hashtags linked to his defiance were trending in Washington, London, Sao Paulo. Diaspora donations surged to over $2.5 million in just 2 days. What once looked like a diplomatic noose was transforming into a megaphone. The moment of truth. The United Nations chamber grew tense, heavy as a courtroom. Delegates leaned forward, waiting for the young captain to read the script of surrender. He unfolded the pages, paused, then folded them again. Lifting his eyes, he began. Tell me, when has the world ever apologized to Africa? The silence was crushing. French whispers rustled nervously. The American desk shifted uneasily. Cameras captured the tension of a hall suddenly exposed. Instead of apology, Traoré turned the spotlight back on the assembly itself. He cut through double standards with precision. When bombs fall in your wars, you call it defense. When poverty cripples our children, you call it economics. Why should truth spoken from Africa be dressed as an offense? Then, reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a note. Not written by advisors or diplomats, but in the hand of a child. A girl from Ouagadougou had begged him, please tell them we don't want to be poor forever. Please tell them we are not children. We are people with a heartbeat. That night, the United Nations was not listening to a president. It was listening to a child. And then came the strike no one expected. Yes, I will apologize, they declared. A murmur swept the hall. And then came the blade. I apologize only for one thing, that until today, no one has dared to speak like this before you. The chamber cracked open. Diplomats scribbled furiously. Some froze in disbelief. Others exchanged panicked glances. The 12 pages in his hand had turned to ashes. He had written a new script in real time, in front of the world. What was meant to humiliate became triumph. What was meant to silence became an anthem. And the question the world could not shake was this. Was this the courage of one man or the awakening of an entire continent? Refusing to bow again, The silence inside the United Nations did not last. The world's reaction erupted like a storm. The French delegation stood abruptly, gathering their papers, walking out without a word. Their exit was calculated, a symbolic slap meant to delegitimize his defiance. But outside those marble walls, the story was already spinning out of their control. Within minutes, headlines exploded across digital screens. Traoré turns UN apology into defiance. Clips detonated across social media, subtitled in every language imaginable. Diaspora communities in New York, London, Paris pushed his words into viral orbit. Analysts estimated and paid media exposure worth $120 million in just 24 hours, far more than any Western PR campaign could buy. The African Union moved quickly. Within 48 hours, envoys flew from Addis Ababa to New York. They drafted the New York Declaration. African nation would ever again be coerced into apologizing for asserting dignity. By week's end, more than 20 capitals had signed. What was meant to isolate Traoré had instead forged a continental shield. But the counterpunch came fast. The European Union froze $27 million in development funds. The IMF postponed a debt restructuring session, tightening a noose that could swallow nearly 8% of Burkina Faso's GDP. French newspapers unleashed a barrage of op-eds, painting him as reckless, unstable, dangerous. Leaked documents from Brussels revealed their deeper fear. The Burkina model sovereignty before debt, dignity before compliance might spread like wildfire. And spread it did. Across African cities, his words appeared on banners, walls, murals. Africa doesn't apologize. In Johannesburg, a song sampling his speech climbed past 2 million streams in days. In Dar es Salaam, graffiti artists turned entire neighborhoods into living testimony of resistance. In Ouagadougou, students filled lecture halls, turning civic education into activism. TikTok clips of his defiance racked up millions of views. Even a South African schoolgirl reading his words to her classmates drew over 4 million views. The culture itself was shifting. His speech was no longer just a political event. It had become a living movement. But the shock waves did not end with words. At home, the Burkina government pivoted from rhetoric to policy. Domestic grain production surged after aggressive investments in irrigation, seed banks, cooperative farms. Within a year, Burkina Faso met 95% of its food demand, an achievement once dismissed as impossible for a landlocked nation. Import dependence that drained hundreds of millions annually was slashed almost overnight. Alongside this came a sovereign wealth fund, fueled by gold refinery revenues, projected to reach $1.5 billion within 5 years. Small by global standards, but transformative for 23 million citizens. And beyond its borders, the spark spread. Tanzania passed new rules forcing multinationals to keep 60% of mining profits within the country, redirecting an estimated $2 billion annually into schools and hospitals. Zambia tied copper exports to job creation and technology transfers. Somalia demanded a phased withdrawal of foreign troops. What outsiders branded instability, locals recognized as sovereignty reclaimed. A continental awakening in Addis Ababa. African Union workshops debated collective bargaining. Why negotiate individually when unity multiplies leverage? Think tanks in Lagos modeled stabilization funds to shield states from IMF dictates for a decade. Civil groups in Dar es Salaam marched, demanding leaders follow Burkina Faso's food sovereignty blueprint. For the first time in decades, Africans were not merely reacting to crisis. They were proactively redrawing the map of their future. Yet the road ahead remained perilous. Capital flight loomed. Sanctions hovered. Each gain risked a counterpunch. But the paradox held: the more pressure mounted, the more citizens rallied behind their leaders. So we must ask, has Traoré's defiance set Africa on the path to a genuine renaissance, or has he lit a fire that the global order will try to smother before it fully burns? The world watches from Washington to Paris. The aftershocks of Traoré's defiance were studied like an ERTHQUAK. US analysts admitted the real threat was not Burkina Faso's gold or cotton, but the contagion of its example. If one small nation could stare down the system, what would stop others from following? Europe's view was even more panicked. Leaked memos revealed fears of policy contagion. Tanzania, Zambia, Somalia, and others uniting under a Burkina-inspired model that placed dignity above debt. The IMF itself worried its traditional leverage aid, loans. Restructuring was losing its bite. Meanwhile, in Harlem, in London, in Parisian suburbs, ordinary people rallied. African Americans, Caribbeans, diaspora communities chanted, "No apology for truth." It was as if Traoré's defiance had unlocked memories of their own suppressed histories. The symbolism was explosive. If the United Nations is a theater, then Traoré had walked on stage and set the script on fire. And the world had no choice but to watch. The mirror for humanity. So the question for America is not abstract. It is personal. Do we see Captain Ibrahim Traoré as a destabilizer to be contained, or as a mirror, reflecting the courage we once demanded for ourselves? The world expected a young African leader to kneel. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré stood taller than the script they placed in his hands. What was meant to humiliate became history. His refusal to read those 12 pages was not just defiance. It was a blueprint, a signal that the era of silent obedience may be ending. Think about the weight of that transformation. One moment, Burkina Faso was dismissed as a fragile state dependent on loans. The next, it was a symbol of resistance echoed in chants, painted on walls, remixed in songs, shouted in protest from Ouagadougou to Harlem. It was as if a continent long silenced had found its voice again. But here is the shock that should keep you awake. Every sanction, every frozen dollar, every attempt to suffocate this fire may only fuel it further. Already, Tanzania, Zambia, Somalia are testing their own limits. If this continues, the Burkina spark could grow into a wildfire, reshaping the balance of global power in ways Washington, Paris, Brussels are not prepared to handle. Conclusion: the storm that is only beginning. So I leave you with this question. If a small landlocked nation can turn shame into strength, what excuse do larger, richer nations have for silence when dignity is on the line? Is survival really worth surrender? This is not just Africa's story. It is humanity's mirror. And if you believe this moment matters, don't stay quiet. Share this video. Leave your voice in the comments. Hit subscribe, because this storm is only beginning. And next time, the fire of sovereignty may not burn in Ouagadougou. It may burn in a place you never expected.